Grand Rising, my beautiful kings and queens, and welcome to Morning Tea with Mel B. Today we are starting a powerful week called History They Didn't Teach Us, From Roots to Reality. And we're starting where the school should have started, before the chains. Because too often, African American history is introduced through pain first. The ships, the auctions, the plantations, the chains. But Africa had more history, power, knowledge, trade, kingdoms, scholarships, architecture, spirituality, and global influence long before European slavery tried to rewrite the story. UNESCO identifies Timbuktu as an intellectual and spiritual center in the 15th and 16th centuries, home to the Sankore University and major mosques that reflect the city's golden age. So today we're not erasing slavery by far. We are putting it in its proper place. Slavery was a brutal chapter, but it was not a huge one. So today's topic, before the chains, the history they skipped before slavery. And today we're setting the foundation. Because when people only teach us from oppression forward, they shrink history and our story. They make it seem like survival was our first talent. No, ma'am. No, sir. Survival was not the beginning. Brilliance was already in the room. All right, so let's get to our affirmation of the day first and foremost. So repeat after me. I am not the beginning of my struggle. I am the continuation of wisdom, strength, creativity, and power. My roots are deeper than what tried to bury me. And let the people say, Ashe. Because today is not just a history lesson, it's a reminder. So let's start with some receipts. Before the chains, Africa was not one thing. It was not one culture, one language, one people, one story, or one image. It was, and still is, a continent of civilizations, kingdoms, knowledge systems, spiritual traditions, and trade networks. So let's start with Mali. The Mali Empire, founded by Kata, Jata Keita Kieta, became one of West Africa's most powerful empires. Under Mansa Musa, Mali controlled gold-rich territories and major trade routes, creating enormous wealth and influence. Now let's talk about Timbuktu, because folks love using Timbuktu like it means nowhere. Meanwhile, historically, Timbuktu was a center of learning, manuscripts, scholarships, and spiritual life. UNESCO states that Timbuktu was home to the Sankore University and madrasas, and it became an intellectual and spiritual capital in West Africa during the 15th and 16th centuries. Then we have the Kingdom of Benin in what is now southern Nigeria. The Benin bronzes, created from at least the 1500s onward, included brass and bronze plaques, royal regalia, which are various royal garments, commemorative heads, and works made by special guilds for the royal court of Oba. So when somebody acts like African history is only huts, hunger, hardship, that's not history. That's the world that is trying to put a blindfold over our eyes. And receipts say otherwise. All right, so let's move on to our morning tea. Why were we taught the chains before the crowns? Why is that so many of us learned about Africa through slavery before we learned about kingdoms, universities, trade, science, architecture, art, medicine, and spiritual systems? That matters. Because when a child's first lesson about their ancestry is suffering, that shapes their identity. It shapes confidence. It shapes what they believe they came from. And let's be clear, teaching slavery is necessary, but we are not skipping the pain. But if you start the story at the wound, people may never know there was a whole body before that injury. The transatlantic slave trade was catastrophic. The National Endowment for the Humanities describes the transatlantic slave trade database as documenting about 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homes and forced aboard ships, with about 10.7 million surviving the Middle Passage. But every one of those people came from somewhere. They had languages, they had names, they had families, they had spiritual beliefs, they had skills, they had memory, they had culture. They were not born enslaved, they were made enslaved. There's a distinct difference. All right, on to our daily focus. Kings and Queens, today we're talking about something bigger than dates and names. We're talking about identity. Because when schools start African American history as slavery, they don't just skip information, they skip foundation, they skip pride, they skip context, they skip the part that tells a child you came from people with language, land, memory, knowledge, beauty, power, and purpose. So let's be just clear. The African history did not begin with slavery. African American history did not begin with chains. Slavery interrupted the story. It did not start the story. So let me get to a few points to make that more understandable. Africa was never one thing. We need to stop talking about Africa like it was one place with one story. Africa is a whole continent, different regions, different languages, different cultures, different governments, different spiritual traditions, and different ways of living. That matters because when people flatten Africa into one stereotype, they erase complexity. And once you erase complexity, you can sell people a lie with confidence. Before the transatlantic slave trade, West Africa had powerful kingdoms and city-states. The Jim Crow Museum notes that West African people had rich and diverse histories and cultures before Europeans arrived, including large and powerful empires and kingdoms such as Songhai, Mali, Benin, and Congo. So when somebody acts like there is no history before slavery, that is not ignorance. It's just trying to wipe us out. That is not a whole lie. It is a whole lie. Straight up lie. Simple line. I want the younger viewers to know that Africa was not empty. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. Africa had people, systems, cities, leaders, teachers, artists, farmers, traders, builders, and thinkers. So next, let's talk about leadership. Before the chains, there were kingdoms, there were rulers, there were councils, there were trade agreements, there were laws, there were spiritual leaders, elders, military leaders, and community decision makers. The Mali Empire is one example. Mali became one of the West Africa's most powerful empires, tied to the gold-rich territories and major trade routes. Their most famous ruler was Mansa Musa. And he's remembered for wealth, power, and influence across this wide world. And that is important because people were not taken from nowhere. They were taken from communities. They were taken from organized societies. They were taken from families, farms, markets, towns, religious life, political systems, and cultural memory. Enslaved Africans were not born slaves. They were made enslaved by force. And that language matters. Don't say they were slaves like that was their identity. They were enslaved people because slavery was not something done to them. It was not who they were. That's the difference between history and disrespect. Next, now let's talk about Timbuktu. Some people use Timbuktu like it means way out in the middle of nowhere. The history says IKYFL. Y'all know what that means. UNESCO says Timbuktu was an intellectual and spiritual capital in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was home to the Sankore University and others, and its great mosque, Jenga Raber, Sankore, Sidi Ya still reflect the city's golden age. So when we say before the chains, we're talking about people connected to learning, books, manuscripts, scholarships, faith, and study. So for my younger people out there, the madrasa is a school, often connected to Islamic learning. And Timbuktu was not some dusty old footnote. Timbuktu was an intellectual center. People studied law, they studied religion, they studied language, they copied manuscripts, and they preserved knowledge. So no, knowledge did not arrive in Africa by boat. Knowledge was already sitting at the table. They had books before they were put in someone else's books as property. Think about that. So now let's talk about books and buildings. Great Zimbabwe is one of the strongest examples of African architecture and the engineering before modern era. Smart History describes Great Zimbabwe as the largest stone complex in Africa, built before the modern era outside ancient Egypt. It was constructed between the 11th and 15th centuries and was continuously inhabited by the Shona people until around 1450. So let me translate that. People built large stone structures. People organized labor. People understood design. People created space for community, trade, leadership, and life. And they did it without needing somebody from Europe to come and supervise. Then we have the Kingdom of Benin. Benin bronzes included plaques, commemorative heads, royal regalia, and other works connected to the Obats, royal court. These artworks were made by specialist guilds to show advanced metalworking, political storytelling, royal history, and artistic excellence. So when people say African societies were not advanced, ask them, advanced according to who? Because stone cities, scholarly centers, royal art, complex trade, and political systems sound pretty advanced to me. So before the chains, Africa was connected. Trade routes moved goods, but they also moved ideas. Gold, salt, textiles, books, tools, art, and religious knowledge traveled across regions. Mali's power was deeply tied to trade, especially gold in the Trans-Saharan routes. Trans-Saharan routes. These routes connected West Africa to North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world. Trade means relationship, value, negotiation, skill, Trade means people had something others wanted. So when Africans were later kidnapped and sold into slavery, they were not unskilled labor. They were farmers. They were metal workers. They were builders. They were healers. They were parents. They were navigators. They were artisans. They were spiritual leaders. They were people with knowledge. That's why slaveholders wanted their labor, not because they had no value, because they had value someone wanted to exploit. So now we go into, there's so much more I can go to, but now we have to talk about the crossing. Slave voyages documents that more than 36,000 voyages that forcibly transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1514 and 1866. The National Endowment for the Humanities explains that the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database documents roughly 12.5 million Africans forced onto ships, with about 10.7 million surviving the Middle Passage. That means millions were kidnapped from real lives. Not numbers, not cargo, not nameless bodies. People. People who had birthdays, even if nobody wrote them down. People who had mothers. People who had favorite songs. People who knew the smell of home. People who had languages on their tongues before those tongues were punished. People who had gods, prayers, names, recipes, dances, jokes, skills, and memories. And that is why this lesson matters, because the slave trade tried to turn people into property. And we don't have to keep repeating the lie by teaching them that as property first. They were human before the world tried to make them merchandise. Now let's bring this into today. When a young person only hears your ancestors were slaves, what can happen? They start thinking struggle is their origin. They may start thinking oppression is their natural position. They may start thinking they come from people who had no power, no culture, no system, no beauty, and no brilliance. And that's dangerous. Look at how our young people view themselves now. Look how they think. Look at who they think they are. Imagine if they were taught their truth. Because identity shapes imagination. If you don't know you come from builders, you may not see yourself as a builder. If you don't know you came from scholars, you may think education is outside of you. If you do not know you come from spiritual systems, art, music, science, and leadership, you may shrink yourself to fit somebody else's version of your people. That is why before the change is not just history, it's mental work, mental freedom. It's also repairing the mirror. So, what should schools teach? First, they should teach the origin. Who were African people before they were enslaved? What were their cultures, kingdoms, faith, their trade systems, and family structures? Two, destruction. How did the transatlantic slave trade interrupt lives, destroy families, and create systems of racial slavery? Third, survival. How did enslaved Africans preserve their language, spirituality, and resistance under brutal conditions? Fourth, resistance. How did people fight back through rebellion, escape, education, and culture? And fifth, legacy. How did all of that still live in African American culture today? This is the whole lesson we are going to learn this week here on Morning Tea with Mel B. Not trauma first, truth first. because that is very important. So for my younger viewers, my younger kings and queens, let me say it like this. Imagine if someone took a superhero movie and only showed you the part where the hero got knocked down. You never saw where they trained. You never saw their family. You never saw their powers. You never saw what they built. You only saw the pain. Would you really understand that hero? No. That is what happens when African American history starts as slavery. You are seeing the attack before you understand the people who were attacked. So today we're rewinding that movie. Before the change, there were people with power. And to my grown folks, this is for us too. Some of us were raised on incomplete history. We were taught to survive, but not always taught where our survival came from. Some of us had to learn our roots late. And let me tell you something, late learning still counts. You are not too old to reclaim your history. You are not too grown to heal from what school skipped. You are not too late to teach our children and grandchildren a fuller story. Because once you know better, you can pass down better. And that is how we break the cycle of historical amnesia. So here's what I need us to do to carry on today. Our ancestors were not empty people waiting for history to happen to them. They had history. They had names. They had land. They had beliefs. They had skills. They had music. They had science. They had architecture. They had family. They had memory. The chains were real. The ships were real. The trauma was real. But so was the power before. And if they only taught us the chains, then today we teach ourselves the crowns. Because we did not begin broken. We began rooted. So let's call it out. Who's playing in our face? The people who act like teaching complete history is divisive. Complete history is not divisive. It is honest. What's divisive is teaching children that some people had civilization and others only had suffering. What's divisive is handing out half the book and calling it education. What's divisive is acting like Africa was waiting in the dark until Europe walked in with a flashlight. No, boo. Africa had its own sun. So our receipts from today, Timbuktu was the center of learning. It was just not a faraway place people use as a joke. It was an intellectual and spiritual capital and notes its connections to the Sankore University. 2, Mali was wealthy and powerful. The Mali Empire became powerful through centralized government, diplomacy, military expansion, and control of gold-rich trade routes. Mansa Musa ruled Mali from 1312 to 1337, and Mali's gold and trade networks made it extraordinarily wealthy. 3, Benin had skilled royal artisans. The Benin bronzes were created from at least the 1500s onward by specialist guilds of the Oba World War. They included plaques, royal regalia, animal and human figures, and personal ornaments. 4, the Middle Passage was not the beginning. Slave voyages documented more than 36,000 voyages that forcibly transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1514 and 1866. The National Park Service states that from the 1500s to the 1800s, approximately 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic as human property. Those millions of people had lives before capture. They had homes before ships. They had identities before numbers. So it's hard. It's heavy. Before we move forward, we pause because history is not just dates and documents. History is people, people with families, dreams, voices, names, languages, and unfinished tomorrows. Today, we honor the unnamed ancestors taken during the transatlantic slave trade, the mothers whose children were pulled from them, the fathers who never made it back home, the children whose names were never written down, the healers, the builders, farmers, artists, teachers, storytellers, and spiritual leaders whose histories were stolen, buried, or renamed. The National Endowment for Humanities cites, I'm going to keep saying this, limited, cites the estimates that about 12.5 million Africans were forced aboard slave ships and about 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. That means nearly 2 million people did not survive that crossing. So today we're going to say their names, even when we don't know their actual names. We say ancestor, we say mother, we say father, we say child, we say elder, we say survivor, we say the ones who did not make it. We say the ones who speak, who blood speaks to us still today. The ones who do not remember what happened. We do not remember them for sadness only. We remember them because forgetting is how injustice gets comfortable. And we are not here to make injustice comfortable. All right, let's move on to our common sense court. Today's question is, do schools fail us by starting African American history as slavery? Your voting options are, hold on, let me put them up here for you so y'all can see what the options are for today. So we have A, absolutely, that was intentional. B, yes, because they still can fix it. C, no, teachers only taught what they had. Or D, I need to learn more before ruling. So my take, I think starting the story as slavery gave too many people incomplete identity. It taught the womb before the body. It taught the theft before the treasure. And when you leave out the treasure, people start believing the theft was the whole story. So drop your ruling in the poll. All right, so we're going to go now to Roots to Reality. Today's Roots to Reality's connection is storytelling. Across many African cultures, oral tradition has been a way to preserve history, values, family memory, spiritual teachings, and community identity. Griots, elders, storytellers, songs, proverbs, and spoken word have carried knowledge across generations. And we still do that. We do it at the kitchen table. We do it at family reunions. We do it through music. We do it through church testimony. And we do it when Big Mama says, let me tell you what happened. This is not just talking. This is memory. This is how people survive. This is how people survive when records get destroyed, names get changed, textbooks get lazy. Our mouths became our archives. So today's truth bomb is, you cannot teach people they came from chains and then act confused when they struggle to see their crowns. I'm going to say that again. You cannot teach people they came from chains and then act confused when they struggle to see their crowns. The truth is, African American history includes suffering, yes, but it also includes civilization, innovation, language, spirituality, music, medicine, art, resistance, scholarship, and legacy. We were not empty before oppression. We were full. And that is why we work so hard. But then that's why they work so hard to break us. So, parents and grandparents and all adults, if you want to teach your kids, start teaching them the things that I've said today. The web pages that I used were the UNESCO, UNESCO, World Heritage Center, the Library of Congress, Slave Voyages, National Park Service, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the British Museum, and the World History Encyclopedia. Kings and queens, today we went before the chains. We remembered that our story did not begin with a ship. It did not begin with an auction block. It did not begin with somebody else's ownership papers. Our story began with people, with land, with language, with memory, with tradition, with intelligence, with spirit. So when you walk into this week, walk different. Because when you know your roots, you do not bend the same. Tomorrow we continue with the geniuses they left out, the inventors, builders, and innovators history tried to leave out the books. They gave us chains in the textbook, but we came from crowns in the bloodline. Kings and queens, remember your roots, protect your truth, and rise like legacy has your name on it. Period.